The coronavirus pandemic has exposed gaping holes in Africa's healthcare system. And now the World Health Organization warns that Africa, which is home to 1.3 billion people, could become the next epicenter of this pandemic. According to a WHO study, the pandemic could kill up to 1,900,000 people in Africa in just the very first year if the spread is not contained. The study suggests the pandemic could infect between 29 million to 44 million people in Africa. These shocking projections are based on the assumption that no containment measures have been put in place. 47 countries in Africa currently have a total of more than 53,000 cases and more than 2,000 people have lost their lives. The infection wave has hit Africa later as compared to most parts, but the WHO believes that it could still translate into a prolonged, years-long outbreak if it is not contained. But that's not all. Another survey shows that for every 100,000 people in Africa, there is less than one intensive care bed and one ventilator in place. Clearly, Africa is not prepared to face the pandemic. On an average, 12 patients could be lined up for one ICU bed, and even in the best case scenario, the continent could need at least 10 times the number if the outbreak peaks. And not just the lack of beds, they're also unevenly distributed throughout the continent. Ventilators are also crucial in the fight against the disease. The entire continent has only 9,300 ventilators. South Africa has around 3,300 ventilators, but about two-thirds are in private hospitals, which most people cannot afford. Some nations, such as Guinea-Bissau, have no ventilators at all. But even with availability of equipment, the healthcare system in Africa is majorly understaffed. According to World Bank data, one doctor attends to an average of 80,000 people in the continent. Currently, the number of cases in Africa marginally low, but low levels of testing make it impossible almost to know the actual scale of infections. Africa has carried out around 685 tests per million people. This is in stark contrast to Europe's 23,000 tests per million. But even with that grim forecast, many African nations have moved quickly to contain the virus. Countries are restricting movement and repurposing factories to produce protective equipment to tackle the crisis. International organizations, including the WHO and World Bank, are currently providing assistance to the continent. The World Bank is helping more than 30 African nations with over $1 billion worth of equipment. And joining us live on the broadcast is our correspondent Michael Balek from Kampala, Uganda. Hi, Michael. If you can break down further for us how prepared Africa really is to deal with the impending crisis. Those figures are extremely worrying.
Hello, Molly. This definitely is a public health crisis, and coming to Africa, that is already facing other crises in terms of diseases. We're talking about Ebola, we're talking about yellow fever, we're talking about all other diseases, respiratory diseases like tuberculosis. It becomes a far-reaching crisis to Africa. It becomes a challenge. But of course, when we talk about, everyone thinks Africa is going to be the next hotspot. The WHO has said it. But this depends, and it goes from country to country. And different countries are preparing at different intervals and different times. For example, most African countries like South Africa and Uganda have put in place measures, of course, and these measures include stopping air travel, closing down their borders to other countries. They have stopped work. People, the countries are on lockdown, so people are working from home. And only health workers are allowed to move around and basically in a way to fight against this COVID-19, the spread of COVID-19. They have stopped social gatherings everywhere in Africa. And of course, they are mobilizing, while Africa has their challenges, of course, which comes to access to equipment, like PPEs. When you talk about, and you've talked about enough ventilators, we don't have those ventilators in place. But the leaders are speaking. Today, the South African head of state has met other leaders in Africa, and they have discussed at length on how they can come together and actually fight this COVID-19 pandemic.
Right, and those projections in the WHO report are based on the assumption that no containment measures have been put in place, thus further highlighting the need for these lockdowns. Give us a broad sense of the restrictions that have been imposed in several parts and how effectively they have been enforced on the ground.
For example, in Uganda, we have seen that people cannot leave their homes to go and work. The government is encouraging those actually who can work, maybe to ride their bicycles, but they are not allowed to enter the city center. Crowds are not allowed. They have stopped churches. Mosques have stopped. We are in a fasting Ramadan season, but no Muslim is allowed to enter a mosque. And of course, when social gatherings, when you talk about social gatherings, there's no football anymore. People here in Uganda love football, but they cannot have football anymore. There is no public transport. That has been cancelled. And of course, even the people who are allowed to work, for example, the media, for example, the health workers, there has to be social distancing. And the military has been deployed at different places across the country to ensure that this happens. But of course, in other countries like Tanzania, this has not been possible. Actually, in Uganda, where I'm standing right now, it is for the last 50 cases have been that have come into Uganda have been from truck drivers coming in from Kenya and Tanzania, because in Tanzania, the president doesn't seem to think COVID-19 is a serious thing. So some of it's business as usual in Dar es Salaam and many towns in Tanzania. The airports is still open and people are still moving around and doing their business the way they can. So in those countries, it has been very difficult for them to actually implement and put in place those measures. But in Uganda, you cannot be able to do that. And also, of course, in order to reduce COVID-19, of course, there have been an increase in testing, especially with the help of WHO. Now we have so many tests that are being carried out within the country, and that's why we're seeing numbers coming up. Yes, they may be underreported, but they're coming up because there's more testing. While other countries are only testing those who are people who have symptoms, their symptomatic cases are not tested. But this is coming from country to country. But we're hoping that things may get better in the next few months.
Right, as with several parts, a low testing rate there also a huge concern. We're going to leave it there for the moment. Michael, thanks very much for those updates. The 8th of May holds great significance in human history. 75 years ago, on this very day, the Second World War ended with the surrender of Germany to Allied powers. It was a day when the winning side in Europe celebrated and the world at large took a sigh of relief. The day is fittingly known as Victory Day in Europe. Each day the world commemorates the end of the bloody and disastrous war. It is a day of remembering the young men who laid down their lives on the front as well as behind enemy lines, and the veterans who still carry the demons of losing their friends and a part of their own humanity. Commemorative events were expected to take place with great pomp in the United Kingdom, but the COVID-19 pandemic has subdued those commemorations. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson paid tributes at the Westminster Abbey by lighting a candle at the grave of a World War II soldier. He said that all those born since the year 1945 owe everything to the World War II generation. A 2-minute silence was observed at the Edinburgh Castle to mark the 75th anniversary. While the streets were empty due to the lockdown, the skies wore various shades of celebration. The British Royal Air Force's red arrows painted the sky red, white and blue to mark the 75th anniversary. The flypast was seen across London skies as the aircraft soared over the Thames. French President Emmanuel Macron paid his tributes by laying a wreath of flowers and rekindling the flame at the tomb of a World War II soldier. Macron was accompanied by Prime Minister Edouard Philippe and former President Nicolas Sarkozy and François Hollande. Russia, for the first time, cancelled its Victory Day parade, but Russian military officers and volunteers paid their tributes to the veterans through a musical performance. Many of the veterans watched the performance from their balconies. Germany, which ended up on the losing side, also marked the end of the war. Chancellor Angela Merkel, President Frank-Walter Steinmeier laid wreaths at a Berlin memorial. President Steinmeier also in his speech said that Germans feel gratitude for the Nazi defeat at the war. He said the day of liberation is a day of gratitude for all Germans. Germany has long considered the events of May 8, 1945 not as a defeat, but as a day of liberation from the Nazi tyranny.
Aus vollem Herzen bekennen, die bei unseren Nachbarn neues Vertrauen wachsen ließen, die vorsichtige Annäherung möglich machte.
The end of World War II was a big turning point in the fate of world history. The end ushered in a new world order and a bipolar world with the United States and former USSR at the two extreme ends of that spectrum. Many now see the battle against the coronavirus pandemic as another world war in both scope and sadly ever increasing casualties.
Russia has reported more than 10,000 coronavirus cases for 6 days in a row. Now that's more than 60,000 cases recorded in just 6 days. Russia is now the 5th most affected country in the world from this pandemic. The number of confirmed cases went up by 10,669 cases over the last 24 hours. Now that's a rise in cases by over 10,000 for the 6th consecutive day. The latest spike takes the total number of cases to over 187,000 cases. Latest reports from the Russian government has confirmed 98 new deaths, taking the total death toll to 1,723. Now this is the lowest death toll for a country in the top 10 worst affected countries in the world. US President Donald Trump has said that Russian President Vladimir Putin accepted his offer to provide ventilators, but there has been no confirmation yet from the Russian administration. Now, cases have been registered in all of Russia's 85 regions, but more than half of all deaths and cases have been in Moscow. The citywide lockdown in Moscow has been extended until the 31st of May. Moscow and other Russian regions are in their 6th week of lockdown. In a recent video meet with the governors, President Vladimir Putin warned against any haste in removing preventative measures, but he offered full support to easing some restrictions in Moscow despite the rising cases. In Moscow, the first phase of lifting lockdown measures is set to begin on the 12th of May. Industries and construction work will be allowed to reopen. However, both Putin and Moscow's mayor agreed that it is premature to open up the services sector. It will remain under lockdown until the 31st of May, but some shops will open. Now, outdoor walking and exercise could also be allowed. On the global stage, Russia has surpassed France and Germany in the total number of cases. Now it sits behind the United Kingdom. Russia's mortality rate is low compared to other severely affected countries in the world. As of now, Russia's death rate due to the virus stands at 0.9%. Now that's significantly lower than Britain's 14.9% mortality rate. However, several medical experts are claiming that Russia's mortality rate is much lower as the government is hiding the true number of cases. Now, our WION correspondent Julia Chapman is joining us live from Moscow for more on this story. Good evening to you, Julia. Rising cases of over 10,000 for the 6th consecutive day. We do know that the citywide lockdown in Moscow has been extended until the end of the month, but there's been some easing of restrictions. What are the latest updates that you have for us?
Well, that's right. The situation is getting worse and worse. Another rise of more than 10,000 new cases in a day, and around 50% of those are here in Moscow, which has seen the worst of this coronavirus outbreak. There have been big problems with full hospitals. There have been a number of patients who have had to be taken to hospital, although authorities do say that the hospital system here in the capital is coping, but there are serious concerns about the testing accuracy that's been going on. We've seen the numbers climbing rapidly over the last few days and weeks. Russia now has the 5th biggest coronavirus outbreak in the world, and nevertheless, authorities, including the mayor of Moscow, say that the numbers are likely even higher. Mayor of Moscow, Sergei Sobyanin, says that there are probably around 300,000 coronavirus cases in Moscow alone. That's more than 3 times the official figures that we've been given.
Right, Julia, and we believe that the death toll, the death rate, is at less than 1%, sitting at 0.9. Now, that is significantly lower than other countries that are severely impacted by the virus. Why is this?
Well, that's right. Other countries with a similar number of cases have much higher death tolls in the tens of thousands, whereas Russia's remains under 2,000 so far. Now, part of that is because of the way that Russia has been classifying deaths that have happened during this coronavirus era. It still may be too early to know the full picture, but what we understand is that in a number of cases, deaths have been classified as being caused by something else. So it may not necessarily be that coronavirus was the cause of death, but a patient may have still had coronavirus in their system, and those deaths are not going into the overall tally. Now, we understand that in the coming days and weeks, they may start reclassifying those deaths. They may come up with a system whereby they show 2 different figures, one of deaths that they believe to be directly because of coronavirus, and others deaths that may have been exacerbated by coronavirus but were ultimately down to other reasons. So that is why there is part of that's why we're seeing such low numbers of the death toll. But also, officials say that the number of tests that have been carried out, almost 5 million, accounts for the reason that they have gotten to grips with this this virus better than other countries have. That's what we've been hearing from officials anyway.
Right, and PPE and equipment like ventilators have been making headlines. We are getting reports that President Donald Trump from the U.S. is planning on sending ventilators, and President Putin has accepted this. Have you got any details on that?
That's right. That's from a phone call that the 2 presidents had yesterday. There's been an offer of some ventilators, and President Putin said that Russia may take up the U.S. on that offer. Previously, in the outbreak a few weeks ago, when Russia's figures were much lower, there was a shipment of aid from Russia to the U.S. just as the cases were really getting higher over in that country. So there has been some mutual aid offered between the 2 countries, although there were reports that Russia then asked for payment for those aid deliveries to the United States. In terms of the ventilators, it's a different picture depending on where you look in Russia. Here in Moscow, we understand there are a high number of ventilators. Medical officials say they're fairly comfortable with the number of ventilators they have. We also understand from the mayor of Moscow that the situation in hospitals has stabilized. The number of patients being hospitalized has kind of tapered off, so there aren't too many new admissions to hospital. But outside in the regions, there's certainly more of a concern. There are hospitals who are raising the alarm about a lack of proper equipment, and ventilators is among them.
Julia, thank you very much for that report. That's our correspondent, Julia Chapman, coming.
It's been a tough week. Rising death toll, rising blame game, no sign of a vaccine, so many reasons to lose hope. But giving up is never an option. We need to fight the Wuhan virus, and we need to hold on to every inch of positivity. So let's end the week and the show on a positive note. And this is a very special story that I want to share with all of you. It's a story of sacrifice. Over the last couple of months, everyone has made sacrifices. Most of you have sacrificed your freedom staying at home. Frontline health workers have sacrificed their lives to save others. In Canada, a doctor has sacrificed his tradition, something that he had held on to since birth. This is Dr. Sanjeet Singh Saluja. He lives in Montreal. He's a devout Sikh. He never shaved his beard out of respect for his religion. The practice of kesh, or letting one's hair grow out naturally, was one of Guru Gobind Singh's commandments to his followers. And this conflicted with Dr. Singh's ability to serve as a doctor during the coronavirus crisis. A long beard made it impossible to wear a face mask. So Dr. Sanjeet Singh and his brother shaved off their beard. He says the choice was not easy.
My brother and I, it's part of our religion, and we've always kept a beard. Before this happened, we spoke with people in our religion, our family, our friends, and we discussed it. And it was one of the hardest decisions we've ever made.
One of the saddest things that he's ever done, he says, but he has no regrets. He says the decision was the right one because it allowed him to continue serving his patients. And this story leaves us with so many thoughts. For me, the biggest takeaway is the selflessness on display here. It is easy to become self-absorbed in times of crisis. We tend to think about ourselves first, our mental health, our physical health, our well-being, our family. And it's okay to prioritize yourself, but some battles cannot be won alone. If we want to win the battle against this deadly virus, we will have to start putting others before ourselves. Compromising on social distancing is not okay. You may be able to withstand the virus, but what about the person you infect? Hoarding on essential supplies is not okay. Think about others in the community. Help those who are going hungry to bed. It's time to be a little selfless. Think about it.